Students of medieval history. Today we're going to begin looking at the Anglo-Saxons, which were a tribal cultural unit of Germanic peoples that came across the English Channel and settled most of present-day Britain, except for in the far north in Scotland or in Wales. They did not make it all the way over to Ireland either, but they settled really what is today England. So when you say England, you are actually referring to Angloland, which is the land of the Anglo-Saxons. And we will begin by looking at sort of how these people came to England, or to the Isle of Britannia, and we will then move into sort of the basis for their juridical process and their society, how their societies were organized, this kind of land ownership and justice systems. We will look at the role of women in Anglo-Saxon society, and ultimately the role of the Vikings as they came over and invaded Anglo-Saxon England. And we will conclude with King Edward the Confessor, right before the Norman conquest in 1066. So let us get started, and we're going to turn back time just a little bit and really look at the earliest part of British history to bring us right into the Anglo-Saxon period, and we'll get through this quite quickly. So anytime you're studying Britain, you really are thinking of a world apart. It's not really Europe, even as today we see the Brexit crisis. Is Britain its own thing, or is it part of Europe? And I think this is a great question that is posed throughout all of British history. It seems to be something sort of set apart, that it's kind of European, but yet something of its own culture. And I think this might be exhibited most well in a speech from Richard II. And it's John of Gaunt, who is the Duke of Lancaster, in one of Shakespeare's great plays, his death speech. And he's describing Britain. He says, "This royal throne of kings, this sceptered isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall or as a moat defensive to a house, against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England." So within this speech is sort of this mythos of Britannia, and that its island mentality, that it is protected by the sea. It is its moat against enemies, against plague, against all things. But we look in history, in some cases this is true. But nevertheless, when we see other aspects of English history, the moat that is the English Channel has as many times served as a highway that has brought raiders and new settlers into England as often as it has proved a defensive fortification against those who did not want to come in. As we will see, the Anglo-Saxons themselves were used the sea as a highway to come straight into Britain. The Vikings will do the same. The Normans will do the same. So many times in history, the sea has proved as much of a road straight into Britain that allowed for the Vikings, for instance, to come in and make a swift conquest and to leave very quickly, as it has proven a defensive fortification. But nevertheless, throughout English history, they will see themselves as protected in a way that other lands are not. And I think that there is definitely something to this, but always to keep an eye on how many times the sea has led to invasion or migration as it has to defense. So ancient Britannia was covered in forests, and as peoples moved onto the island, they cut down many of the forest, and today England is not nearly as forested as it was in ancient times. especially really by the 1700s, it had been almost totally deforested, and really an ecological disaster upon the land. But it has made for the beautiful little fields that are surrounded by hedges and such as today. Whereas in ancient times, it would have been almost totally covered with deciduous and conifer forests. So migration has happened numerous times onto the Isle of Britannia, and if you take our ancient history class, you can hear about this in more detail. But the earliest set of Stone Age people were the Beaker. We simply call them the Beaker people, named after their kinds of pottery. And they were the earliest settlers of Britannia, we believe. And these are all the people who created these great megalith stone structures, such as Stonehenge. And they settle all over Europe, and we know them by their pottery and their monuments, their stone monuments. But especially in Britain, there is numerous large standing stone areas that these people settled, and we don't know a lot about them because they have no written culture. We only know what archaeology can tell us. The Beaker people were put out of existence effectively by an Iron Age civilization, the Celts, which they also are a illiterate culture, and we can only know kind of what archaeology tells us. But they came to Britannia around the year 1000 BC, and what we know about Celtic society basically comes from Roman sources that tell us about this. But they are a rural people, meaning that they do not have urban settlements. They are largely pastoralists, meaning they only keep animals. They don't do a lot of settled farming, and that they were great warriors, that they developed iron technologies that led them to be able to have large conquests of areas and be very formidable warriors, even sacking the city of Rome in about 390. And this was not a unified civilization. So when I say Celtic, it is a linguistic, cultural group, not a society in and of itself. That they all spoke similar languages, but they were not sort of one cohesive political unit. And this is a tribal culture. It is not individualistic, meaning that certain tribes controlled areas of land, and you did not have private property rights, so we believe. And they loosely had a sort of a chief or a leader, which they will call a brehon. And these people would come together in larger groups, and they would form these large war bands that would then go out and raid and pillage and defend their own lands. So it's a very warlike and also migratory people, because they are of course pastoralists, so they have to be able to move their animals around in order to graze them so that they might survive. So the Celts, like the Beaker people before them, and of course remembering, if you begin to ever feel sad for the Celts as the Anglo-Saxons come over and conquer them, remember that they came over and they basically exterminated the Beaker people, and so don't feel too bad for them. But the Anglo-Saxons will eventually do unto the Celts as the Celts did unto the Beaker people. But before the Beaker people, or before we get to the Anglo-Saxons, I want to just look very quickly at Romano Britain and the legacy that Rome brought to England. Now, there were two invasions of Britannia when it was not a Roman province. And the first is Julius Caesar, where Caesar just basically, he needs some propaganda, and he's a great adventurer, Rome's greatest general. And so he goes over to Britannia, takes his troops out on the beach, rides his horse up onto a hill, plants a flag, or the Roman eagle, and says, I hereby have conquered Britannia, and I have defeated a small band of warriors, and therefore I am a great hero and have conquered all of Britain. And then he goes back to Gaul and eventually back to Rome to become dictator for life. But the Caesarean invasion of Britain is basically just a trade outpost and to establish some links with Britannia, between Britannia and the province of Gaul, present-day France. And the real important invasion that comes from Rome is under the Emperor Claudius in 43. And he sends over a massive force of 40 legionnaires, or 40,000 legionnaires, and it takes about 20 years to conquer most of Britain, and they will eventually build a wall in the north in order to sort of demarcate what is Romano-Britain from sort of the wild lands of the north and in Scotland. And what they want to do is establish Roman civilization, so they want to build Romano-style urban centers, as well as sort of their latifundian farm systems, where there will be an aristocrat that is served by a large cohort of slaves that would farm the land. And then this would, of course, establish commerce and wealth and trade between all the Roman provinces in the north. So this is really the key motivation early on. And you can today go to Britain and view many of the great cultural feats that were, or the structures that were built, and which is quite amazing within Britannia that they were able to build all these things, considering the kinds of civilizations that were, or the kinds of people that were living there. But after the Romans push out the Celts, and they push the Celts into the fringes of Wales and the northern regions of Scotland, which is sort of the native Celtic Britons, where they will be living. And even today, this is still called the Celtic Fringe. But the Romans then, of course, brought all the things that Romans loved. They built baths and theaters. They built their villas. They established commerce. They built roads. There was a system of money that was established. And then they also brought in and used and traded with the Celtic peoples that were there within their systems, and they wanted assimilation. They didn't want just simply absolute conquest, but they wanted to bring the Celts into their culture. So we see in many cases that these Romano, or these Celtic kings and tribal leaders, they want to send their sons to Roman schools to be educated, and it was quite competitive, and they were eager to do so as time goes on. But as Rome begins to fall, as we talked about in our lecture, or one of our earlier lectures, about the crisis of the 3rd century, that Rome begins to collapse, and the situation is very strongly felt within Britannia itself, the province of Britannia now. And there were raids that begin with the breakdown of central authority in Rome, and as the legionnaires are sent back to continental Europe, and even all the way back to Italia. The tribal peoples that surround Britannia and Romano Britannia know of this, right? They hear of this and see that the province is lying unprotected, so they began to raid to get wealth from the Romans. Plague hits, as with all the rest of the western part of the Roman Empire. Economic crisis hits Britannia very hard. Wealth and commerce ceases. This is all enormous problems. And around this time, we began to see forts being built all along the coast. And there's this one particular individual who will be created, called the Count of the West Saxon Shore. And this person is sort of in charge of the defenses of the coast. So we can already see that there is this fear from seaborne invaders and people who are going to raid this area. And there's even a belief among the Romano British intelligentsia that there's sort of a grand conspiracy between the Scoti in the north, the Welsh in the east, or excuse me, in the west, and the Saxons in the east. That they're all sort of going to come at the same time and attack Britain, and that they would be completely surrounded. Now, after the crisis of the 3rd century is abated, the great Roman leaders such as Emperor Theodosius the Great, and then later Stilicho, the barbarian general, they bring armies, and they're able to sort of patch things up in Rome. But things will go downhill quite quickly after the death of Stilicho. As Rome is divided and that there are many Germanic invasions that come into the Roman Empire from the north, Rome, of course, is sacked by Alaric the Goth in 410, as we learned about in a previous lecture. But how does this specifically affect the province of Britain? Well, there's a famous letter from one of the citizens there, or he's a prefect in the Roman army in 411, and he writes, "The barbarians push us back to the sea pushes us back to the barbarians. Between these two, we are either drowned or slaughtered." So it's not a happy time in Britain as the Roman Empire begins to crumble and collapse. And eventually, shortly after this letter is written, the Romano-British citizenry writes a letter to the Emperor Honorius, and they ask him to send troops to sort of help their beleaguered province, to protect them from all these invading Germanic peoples. And Honorius simply cables back to them, and he says, "Look to your own defenses. We have no troops to send you." So effectively, in 412, the province of Britannia is completely abandoned by Rome. So what do we have to look at of what is Rome's greatest role, its legacy to the ancient world of Britannia? And that is one of roads and commerce. Britain brought wealth, and it built roads that would be used all the way into the early modern period. And it's still where the Romans built these roads have turned into the great highways of Britain today that we drive our vehicles on. But we see here that Rome had a great legacy that it left to Britain. So today you can still go and visit the baths of Romans that in the city of Bath in England. So there is a great cultural legacy and a great sort of structural infrastructure kind of legacy that Rome left to Britain. But also with the loss of Rome and central management and culture and literacy, wealth, this brings Britannia into sort of a dark age of commerce, because as the Saxons will come and establish new civilizations, the lack of trade and sort of any kind of international presence is just sort of abates. That it really becomes a land of subsistence and not of flowering commerce as during the Roman period. So who were the Saxons? And there's much debate among historians of this term, whether it was an invasion or whether it was a migration. So we have to look at our historical sources on what this might be when the Saxons come over into Britannia. And if we look at the literature, basically we have very, very little writing and sources to go on about this time period. There's just very little writing that has survived about this, but our most principal source is the Venerable Bede, who writes the Ecclesiastical History of Britain, and this is where we get this theory of the three peoples who come over and invade Britain, and Bede is very convinced it was an invasion, that it was a violent overthrow of the Romano-British culture, and that they established the Saxons, the Angles, and the Utes, which are three tribal peoples of Germanic origin, that they established themselves and set up shop in England by force. Now we see archaeology, that there is definitely evidence that a Saxon presence has come into England during the 5th century AD, but it's really unclear within archaeology of how violent this is. But there's definite evidence that there's a shift in the pottery, in the material culture, from one of Romano-British, Celtic material goods to one of Saxons being the principal material culture throughout most of England. Now we have the ability to look at sort of DNA, and we can definitely see within modern British people that there are strains of feminine Celtic DNA within the modern British, but there's very little of the male Celts, the native Celts and Romano-British within the current British people. So it's likely that the men were largely executed by the Saxons, and that the Celtic women were then assimilated. It might be a good word, maybe not a good word. They were assimilated into Saxon society. So the Saxons took the Celtic women as wives and murdered the men. Is one explanation for this. So there is sort of another theory that Bede he tells us that there was a Welsh king named Vortigern, and he asked for help from a couple of great war leaders among the Saxons, who was Heinz and Horsa, and these two war leaders brought their warriors over and helped Vortigern in a struggle against an enemy. And so there is some suggestion that it might have been a gradual coming over, that the Saxons were actually invited to come over to sort of be arbiters and to be mercenaries to help the native Celtic peoples fight against each other or against the Romano-British. So there's a lot of theories, and this is sort of where historians can do their work today. But I'll leave that up to you to ponder on, but there's a lot of explanations for this. But we will follow Bede, and we will say that to some degree, at least, this might be sort of not a zero-sum game, that all of this might have been true. That what we do definitely see are there are groups of people of Germanic origin who began coming over to the Isle of Britannia around the year 450. And we will say that these are the Angles, the Saxons, and the Utes, and they settle in different areas throughout England, and they will form the Heptarchy, these 7 kingdoms that will eventually come to dominate later Anglo-Saxon history. But this is a much later development, and this is still a very tribal and warlike culture. And this is where we develop the earliest of English languages. That this is sort of this curious blend between all these Germanic tongues that form Old English or Anglo-Saxon, which you can understand and read if you are a native English speaker. Middle English, Elizabethan English, but you, without training, could understand very, very little of Old English. It's really a language in and of itself. Now, also around 450 develops this great legend. Was there a King Arthur? A real King Arthur? Or is it just, was this mythical king just that, sort of a legendary figure who never really existed? And around 450, there was a defeat of the Saxons by some great war leader. And this stopped the Saxon advance on Britain for about 50 years. And this is referred to as the Battle of Badon Hill. And the earliest historical source we have for this is 100 years later from this monk named Gildas in Wales. And he suggests that the Saxons were invited to Britain by Vortigern, the Welsh war leader, the king, and then these people refused to leave. And then another great war leader among the Welsh named Arthur defeated them at Badon Hill. There's another reference to an Arthur. Actually, Gildas the Wise does not actually refer to Arthur. He just says a great war leader. a Welsh poet, 100 years later, he's praising the actions of a great warrior king in Wales, and he's saying, oh, he defeated 200 men by himself. He built great structures. He pacified the lands, but he was no Arthur. So this poet seems to be hearkening back to a great war leader that stopped the Saxons. There is a historian named Nennius, and 100 years after the Welsh poet, he lists a series of great battles that the kings of Britain won against the Saxons, and the first of these was the Battle of Badon Hill, which is supposedly where Arthur won this great victory. And Geoffrey of Monmouth, who writes his history of the kings of Britain, many years in the high medieval era, suggests that there was a King Arthur who won over the Saxons, and he sort of brings all these legends to fruition. And finally, Sir Thomas Malory, writing in the Tower of London in his The Death of Arthur, Le Mort d'Arthur, he brings all the legends together and popularizes them within this great work of literature that when we think of King Arthur, this is what we think about now: knights and chivalry. So if King Arthur was a historical figure, he definitely was not riding around as a Christian knight of chivalry with Lancelot and his great knights of the Round Table, but rather he was likely a Welsh war leader from the Celtic origins that defeated the Saxons for some time, and maybe commemorated as this great hero of Britain in that sense. But he is probably not the great figure of Sir Thomas Malory's book, ruling over all of Britain and being this benevolent and wonderful king. But there is always, remember, in mythology, a kernel of truth, that a legend is not preserved for thousands of years if there's not some kernel of truth in this. So whether King Arthur was real or legendary is difficult to say from a purely historical point of view, but his legend lives on and inspires many, and there probably is something to the legend of King Arthur, but how much of it is truth and how much is legend is difficult to say. So let us begin looking at Anglo-Saxon society. So the Saxons came over, and they did successfully take over much of England eventually by the year 550. So tribal peoples sort of have their own individual rules and organization, and they develop their laws within a very close and tight-knit group, and it becomes something that we call customary law, sort of within a tribal group, that this is how we've always done things. But as time progresses and the society becomes larger, the warriors become more powerful and rich, and social stratification begins to happen. You transition from being a war leader, a sort of a chief among your people, to sort of this hereditary office of king, or that you become more powerful than that of the customary law, that you can then give command rather than just simply enforcing customary law, that you can create law through because of your office and how powerful you are. So we see a transition throughout this time from customary law to the command of sort of war leader kings. One of the most important things within Anglo-Saxon society is this thing called a vergeld, or a weregeld in proper Midwestern English. We see this word, this Anglo-Saxon word, ver, and geld, meaning head price or man price. So when we see the word werewolf, for instance, it's man wolf. So this is how much money it costs if you kill someone, because there's no jails and there's no police force. And in the event that you go over to the local ale house and you get drunk and you get in a fight with one of your Anglo-Saxon friends there, and you kill him in a fight, you don't go to court, you don't serve a prison term. His family will demand from your family a price, which is a amount of money that you have to pay to that family based upon the value of the person that you killed. So this is sort of a way of maintaining peace throughout the land. It would be enforced to some degree, at least by the tribal leaders, the war leaders, the kings. But this is sort of an early form of justice in a way. And the price of the person that you killed was based upon their social rank. So the highest rank is Ealdorman, sort of a count or a duke, or that's a person who controlled a large amount of land. Then you have a thane, which is sort of a petty lord over a land, just a sort of one village. And these change over time. But and then you have a churl, which is sort of a peasant who's a free worker of the land, who's not a serf. And each of these have their own basis of price for the amount of money that you if you would kill someone who is one of these ranks. So it's obviously very high if you murdered an Ealdorman, and it's much lower if you kill a churl. Now, this is to prevent blood feuds where families would go to war against each other to get justice. So the development of a Vergeld was created. So also within Anglo-Saxon society, it's a farming culture. That this is a transformation of the land into farms, and there are different styles of farms and whatnot, but basically this is a farming agricultural society, and it's rural, it's not urban. They were pagans. The Anglo-Saxons were not Christians, so this will become problematic later, and there will be a conversion of Anglo-Saxon England. And they followed sort of the general Northern Germanic pantheon of Woden and Thor and all this. And even in our own society today in English, we have the commemoration of this within our days, right? Thor's Day or Thursday. So this is still a hearkening back to Anglo-Saxon times. And medicine is very primitive at this time. Of course, you don't have doctors and things like this, and there are tracts of how you deal with things. These medicinal theories. And so there's one famous writing from the 10th century that is just the author is sort of named the Bard. And he suggests how you might heal a cow who has been shot by an elf's arrow. So medicine is sort of a very localized affair, and one that is there as much magic as there is actual science in dealing with things. So the highest form of religion within this Germanic pantheon, I mentioned that they were polytheistic pagans, and sort of the highest religious honor is to make it to Valhalla, sort of a heavenly mead hall in the sky, that you had to die in combat, you had to die a great war hero, and that is sort of the highest ideology, the highest thing that you can do within this Germanic religious ethos. So the warrior is the thing that is valued enormously within Germanic religions and later Scandinavian religions. And we see this commemorated within their writings. And one of the most famous Anglo-Saxon pieces of writing is Beowulf, and it's this story of he's not even an Anglo-Saxon, he's a Geat, which is a Scandinavian from Denmark, and it's basically a tale of this great warrior who comes over and conquers. He's he asks to help one of the kings of Anglo-Saxons, and he goes out and he conquers this great monster Grendel and Grendel's mother, and he eventually goes and fights a dragon, but he dies with his sword in his hand as this great hero who has made his name and is commemorated through all time. So this is the highest, as I'm saying, the highest ideology within this cultural ethos, is that to be the warrior, to conquer, to die in combat as a great hero of your people, and then your story, your memory would be passed down as told by these tales over and over again within their oral culture. And Beowulf is just one of these surviving stories, but it's the most famous because it was written down, and it's written long after its origins. But these tales, like Beowulf, of these heroic epics, would be passed down orally from generation to generation, as these stories are kind of told around in the mead halls and around the fires of these great heroes, and that all people would want to emulate these tales. So I did discuss here in kind of developing Anglo-Saxon social hierarchy, right? That you have these ranks of people. And it goes all the way from sort of king to slave, and the Anglo-Saxons had a slave culture, that they were not a feudal culture yet, and we'll talk more about feudalism in the next lecture. But the social hierarchy is one of where the king would award. He would award a tract of land, because this is where all wealth is within the society, right? There's no massive amount of business or anything like that. All wealth is generated through agricultural production. So the king would award his chief followers, sort of the nobles of the time, who were called ealdormen, and he would give them a certain amount of land that they would then keep, and then the ealdormen would give land to his chief men, his great warriors, thanes. And then, of course, the churls were the peasants who worked the lands, who were free people. And then the people who worked the farms of the thanes and ealdormen were slaves. The churls might work that, but they were not attached or bound to the land in the same way that sort of a tenant farmer, a vassal of the Middle Ages would be. Sort of it's a different system in Anglo-Saxon England than developed within later feudalism, which we will explore in the times to come. That people were not serfs in Anglo-Saxon England in the way that they would be in later feudal times. So how did women factor within this society? So women had a much more prominent role that they played within Anglo-Saxon England. They could inherit property, and in the event that their husband died, a widow retained their property. They could control their property. They had a very important role that they played within agricultural society, in that they worked right alongside all the men. There's sort of this myth that women in medieval society had no place, and that they were sort of domestic, kept within the households, and they had very low status. Well, nothing could be farther from the truth. Within medieval society, women actually have enormously important roles to play. That they were working in the fields, and they were doing all the things that the men were doing. Now to be fair, men, they did own the property. They were the warriors. Women were typically not a warrior elite within this society. But at the same time, really below the highest stratas of society, women were able to do and own and play a role in ordering society and family in a way that they just simply weren't later as we get into the modern periods. So women actually have a very high role within Anglo-Saxon society. And it's interesting, if you look at, remember I said the Vergeld, that a woman between the age of 14 and 30 actually has a much higher Wehrgeld than a man of the same age. So if a woman's Wehrgeld is 5 times that of a woman between the ages of 14 and 30 is worth 5 times a man of the same age if they are both churls. Why is that? Well, because women, that is the height of fertility in a woman. So they are greatly valued for their ability to produce children, meaning that it would cost you 5 times what you would have to pay if you killed a man if you killed this woman, because you had to have enormous amounts of people to work farms and to help within the society. So if you would kill a woman, it's an enormous loss to the society in that she can no longer propagate the society. So in many ways here we already see wealth as being tied to sort of reproductive rights, but or value, or reproductive value. But within this society, I think overall we can say that women held a much higher role and more prominent place than in much later medieval societies and especially modern societies until quite recently. So we see here in Anglo-Saxon England, as time goes on, we see the development and transformation of tribal leadership to that of where you really have kings who are controlling areas of land. And these are often called petty kings because these are very small kingdoms. England in and of itself is a pretty small kingdom, but then you see this thing we call the heptarchy, which are 7 kingdoms, and you can see these kingdoms here. And the native Romano-Britons and Celts are pushed into Wales, into Scotland, and the Anglo-Saxons completely take over all political and social control of Britannia. And with that, they bring their own religion, of course. Christianity is entirely extinguished from England proper, and there's no centralized government per se. Each one of these nations is sort of ruled and controlled by its own kingship, but the kingship is not a neat and orderly succession passed from father to son, but rather it is sort of the succession is based upon one's ability to lead and to lead war parties. So just because you're the son of the king does not mean that you are going to be the next king. Rather, you need to be a great war leader and be able to inspire people in order to take over the kingship in any of these kingdoms. And as I said, we see this gradual transformation of the kingship to one of a war leader, to a king, to sort of one of more centralized hierarchical control. And we see an evolution of supremacy within each of these petty kingdoms. That eventually we will see, or first we would see Northumbria, which is the kingdom in the north of England. It would become sort of the leading kingdom that would dominate all the rest during the 700s. Mercia, the central kingdom, these are the largest of the kingdoms, and it was sort of in central England, and it would be in the 800s. It would become sort of the dominant kingdom, and its king, its premier king, Offa, he becomes friends with Charlemagne, and they write back and forth together as nearly as equals, as so they would say. Though Charlemagne was definitely more important, but they write back and forth, and Offa was able to develop a system of commerce with coins and such. But he would produce sort of a flowering of Anglo-Saxon society that it becomes more centralized, much more controlled and managed. And Offa is able to build this thing called Offa's Dyke, which is a very large fortification of an earthen wall between Wales and England, and you can still see this today. It was so big, so it's an incredible feat of engineering and centralized management of taxation, of commerce. They have to have the wealth in order to build these things. So trade is one of the greatest advents of sort of Mercian supremacy within Anglo-Saxon England here. And then finally, we will see the supremacy eventually of Wessex under King Alfred after the time of the Viking invasions. And Northumbria, Mercia will become overwhelmed by the Danish invaders, and only Wessex will be preserved. And sort of within these time frames, we see this office that is sort of uncertain. It's unclear what it is and what it did, what it meant, but it's called Bretwalda, or Britain ruler, in the Anglo-Saxon. And does this mean that you were a high king, and this is an office that is sort of awarded from time to time? Certain people will claim this title. Who awards this title is sort of unclear as well. What it meant, does it mean that you are then the high king over all other kings? Does it sort of mean you were the first among equals? Very unclear, but certain kings will claim this title of Bretwalda, meaning that they are the Britain ruler, that they rule the entire province of Britain, the old Roman province of Britannia. And at this time, we begin to see each of these kings that they will issue law codes. They are declaring the customary laws of the land within their law codes. Alfred the Great's most famous is Dombuch, that he would give dooms that were the customs of the land, but they would also be the issues and the commands of the king within these as well. There is a council that the king called together of his leading citizens. It's called a witan, or a witan. That is just the king's council is what this is, and some will argue that this was the primitive form of parliament, that all the wise men of the kingdom came together to offer counsel to the king, and this was therefore the earliest of parliaments. Well, not really. This is just the king's council that comes together to give him advice. And the king does not have to call the witan. The king can dismiss the witan whenever he wants, and he doesn't have to listen to them at all, right? So this has really no effective ability to have any power other than just simply to give advice to the king. So if you broke the king's law, if you went against the one of the declarations and the customary laws of the land, you became an outlaw, meaning you were in breach of the king's peace. So therefore, you could be legally killed by anyone to do this, or if you broke the king's law. How was a new king selected? So it still is not a hereditary kingship. So this council of wise men, upon the death of a king, the witan, would come together, and they would then select who they believed would be the next best king. So just to say again, if you were the king's son does not automatically mean that you are going to be the next king. Rather, this council of wise men, the witan, is going to come together, and they are going to select who is going to be the best king who would among them. So anytime you are dealing with an agricultural society, we have to look at the power of land ownership and of farming. So Anglo-Saxon custom and the how land is referred to is it also comes with it political organization. So a hide in Anglo-Saxon times is just simply enough land that one family can support itself. This might be 20 acres, this might be 100 acres. It just depends on where you are. There's no real guarantee over how big this area tract of land is, but it simply means enough land to support one family. So within this it comes organization, agricultural organization, but it also comes political organization. So 100 hides of land will be the Anglo-Saxon term for 100. And this is the amount of land, or so 100 families within this is governed by the king's reeve, or a thane, right? This is the lowest social rank, or the highest, the lowest rank of the nobility, right? A thane is governing over 100 hides. So then within this, you would have 220 to 500 hundreds, which equals a shire, and that is governed by a shire reeve, or an ealdorman, an earl later on that will come. So this is a much larger area of land. So you get the word sheriff that comes out of this. The shire reeve, whoever the leading reeve of the king's reeve within this area, who reports to the king and sits on the witan, is the shire reeve, meaning he's over the entire shire, which is the basic political unit for each kingdom. So you also, within each village, there's very small villages, is governed over by a bailiff. And what did these people raise? But they were growing really heavy cereals, barleys and rye and wheats. They were also raising cattle and sheep. So this is how the economy and agriculture worked within Anglo-Saxon England, and sort of within this agricultural hierarchy is also the political organization of the land. So when you have a society, you have to order this society. And this is very much a time, there's no police forces. There are these issues of laws by kings, but how do you enforce something? A law is pretty worthless if you can't enforce it. So actually within Anglo-Saxon England, we see highly complex systems of justice. So if you were in breach of the king's law, you could find yourself arrested by a reeve, or a shire reeve would be out after you. Now these would have to be very serious offenses for a reeve to come out after you. But if you were caught and you were chained up in the reeve's dungeon, and then you might find yourself facing a trial. And within this, it is a trial by jury. This is one of the gifts that the Anglo-Saxons leave to us, that they are, first, you have a right to be tried by a group of your peers, and you could ask for there are several ways of doing justice, in that you could have compurgation or ordeal. So in the event that you were charged with a crime, you simply, in compurgation, could get a group of people together, depending on the severity of the crime, that are called compurgors, meaning that they will come and say that there is no possible way that this person could have committed this crime. So if you could get 10 or 20 compurgors within your local area to come forward, landowning people, to say that there's no way that this guy did whatever they're saying, then you are innocent of the crime. Now, this sounds kind of silly to us, but in a very close, small society, people know what's going on. They understand, they know people. They know how things work. And this is actually a way of kind of local justice that is effective in some ways, meaning that if you were a good, law-abiding citizen, and you were unjustly charged, that you could get a lot of people to come forward and say that this guy is a good guy, and he wouldn't have done this. Whereas if you were sort of a lowlife and hated by everyone, perhaps injustice could be done to you in this way, but that you then could not find enough compurgors to come forward and say that your character was irreproachable and that you didn't commit this crime, that in all likelihood then you did commit this crime. So that's just one form of justice. The ordeal is where you could ask to have a trial by ordeal, and they would get a cauldron of boiling water, and you would put a pebble in the bottom of it, and you would have to reach your hand down in and pull the pebble out. Then your hand, of course, your skin is burnt horribly, and your wounds are wrapped up and examined by a priest in 3 days. And if your wounds are healing very well, then you are innocent of the crime. God has judged you innocent, and if they are not healing well and there's infection, well, you are guilty, and therefore you are guilty of the crime. God has judged you that you have done this crime. So these are just a couple forms of justice, of primitive justice within Anglo-Saxon society, and you could face these kinds of justice or official trial by jury within the lowest courts, which are the 100 courts presided over by the reeve, or you could then, if it's a more serious crime to be heard, you would go to the shire court, which is a meeting of all the reeves and presided over by the sheriff, and finally the king's court over all the shires. So there is a decent system of a hierarchy of justice here, where crimes could be heard, and it's very unique within early tribal societies. And Anglo-Saxon society is kind of sophisticated in this way, unique almost in the ancient world. So, famously, within Anglo-Saxon society, we have Vikings. Viking raids that they begin to show up around the year 790. Now, the word Viking actually is not a noun. It does not describe people, but it describes an action. So people from Scandinavia, Northmen, as they were referred to, not really as Vikings, they would go a Viking. And that means they go out and they travel around and they pillage and they find lands and they bring back wealth to their homelands. Why were they going a Viking? Because there's several theories with this, but basically a lack of opportunity and farmland within Scandinavia. So the young men who were unable to get lands, they have to find a way of getting wealth, and so they can start their families. So we see within Norse culture that they are forced sort of to go out and to find wealth in alternative ways, and this is through conquest and pillage. So this is why these Northmen go a Viking. So the earliest raids against England are within monasteries. And I mentioned that Christianity had been wiped out, but it had arisen again after the reconversion of Britannia by the Romano Christians. And the monasteries were massive sources of wealth. They were kept, contracts were kept there. The monasteries owned much land, and people gave enormous amounts of wealth to these institutions. For the monks, they were considered very highly important holy men in the area. They were given wealth for their prayers, that they would pray that God would help the people in the area. And eventually, the Vikings will discover that these people were, or these areas were completely unprotected, because you cannot in Christian society attack a monastery. It's a massive sin and a breach of the king's peace and all these kinds of things. But the Vikings find them completely unprotected and sources of enormous wealth. So they would come in and they would raid, and they would go into the monasteries and steal all the treasure, and most of the time kill the monks and this kind of thing. But it was just a dreadful time, if we can believe the writings from the monasteries. And of course, their opinions might be a little bit skewed about the Vikings, but they just describe them as sort of these godless heathens, these demonic force that descends from the north and destroys everything in its path. That they were almost subhuman in some ways, according to the writings of the monks. And one of them famously writes that in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that this was an age when Christ and his saints slept, meaning that God had just forgotten the Anglo-Saxons at this time. It was so horrible. So the first raids of the Vikings for the first 60 or 70 years is just simply hit and run. And that they would come in for a short time, and they would pillage, and then they would go home as fast as they came. And they would show up in their longboats, which allowed them to travel very easily and navigate shallow rivers, and then they would row back out to sea. So they're great developers of technology and seamanship. And then eventually, the Vikings would come and they would settle into England after about 850. And there's this great, this enormous fleet that shows up, rows up the Thames River, and they settle in England, the Great Heathen Host, as they are called. And this is where the Vikings began to settle, actually, in England over the course of the next 70 years after this. So just to say, this is a bit of modern analysis, but this is actually a modern-day Viking and my tennis partner. And so you can see that actually the theories that these Vikings were sort of a subhuman race by the writings of the monks, they don't seem to be accurate in today. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out and hopefully provide some comedic relief for a long lecture. So during this time, after the sort of settlement of England, we have these things called the Dane Law and the Dane Geld. And the Dane Law, there was eventually King Alfred is going to win a victory, and they're going to begin to divide Anglo-Saxon England from Dane, the lands controlled by the Vikings, which is the Dane Law, which are the Danes, as they were called, or the Northmen. So anything beyond sort of the Thames River estuary is going to be, anything north of that is going to be considered under the Dane Law, under the rule of the Danes, and anything south of that will retain Anglo-Saxon laws. And this is an agreement between King Alfred the Great and Earl Guthrum. This was decided in 878. And eventually there will be, as England is sort of reunited, there will be eventually Viking kings over all of England, including Canute the Great of Norway, who was king over England, Norway, and Denmark much later in the 900s. But the Dane Law was, as I say, the region controlled by the Danes, but the Dane Geld was something where there was a price. Remember, any geld is a price. So this was the amount of money that the Anglo-Saxons were willing to pay the Danes not to attack them. Because the Vikings were ferocious warriors, and they were highly successful in defeating the Anglo-Saxons. Only Alfred the Great and his warriors were able to drive them back. So it was much better for the Anglo-Saxons to simply pay off the Vikings under this thing called the Dane Geld, this what they called their price, to not attack the Anglo-Saxons, than to try to fight them. So I want to talk about King Alfred the Great, who is he's actually the only king in England's long history that gets the title the Great. So he was the king over Wessex. So I want to go back. You can see the map here. So it's the southernmost kingdom within the Anglo-Saxon group of kingdoms down here, and you can see it in the south of England all the way over to Cornwall. And King Alfred comes to the throne as sort of this fledgling kingdom, and the Vikings are surrounding them on all sides, and eventually they do conquer all of Wessex, the Vikings do, and Alfred and just his core group of followers sort of flee out to Cornwall, the most western regions in the swamps of England, and this is where they decide that they're going to they want to retain their kingdom. They're going to have to figure out how to defeat the Vikings, and they train and they come. They come back with a vengeance, and they're able to push the Vikings back. But it's through this retreat into the just furthest region of the kingdom of Wessex, and that they're able to be able to figure out a strategy to retrain themselves and to really decide whether this is their courage has to hold, and they have to find a new way forward. They have to reorganize everything, that things are completely different with the advent of the Vikings. And there's this famous story um, of King Alfred, and it's legendary, but it has passed all the way to modern times. So there may be that kernel of truth within this tale, and that is that Alfred, he goes into this peasant's house, a churl's house, and they don't know he's the king of Wessex. That he sits down at the table, and he's beleaguered by the Vikings who have pushed him out, and the lady of the house asks if he would mind to watch the bread in the oven while it's baking, as she has to go out and do some chores. He says, yes, that's fine. And he's thinking about his situation. He forgets about the bread, and it burns, and the lady of the house comes back in, and she begins scolding him, said, you had but one job, to sit here and watch this bread, and you didn't. And Alfred, of course, as King of England, could at that moment have revealed himself, but he doesn't. He apologizes, and he says, it's my fault, and he sort of makes new bread, and he's very humble in this situation when he didn't have to be. So this is maybe a telling, a legend of his character, that Alfred was this humble and good king that accepted his responsibilities, and even though he was king, he didn't use his position as privilege, and because of this, he's very fondly remembered in English history. But on a more macro level, beyond just his character, King Alfred and his witan decide they have to completely reorganize the kingdom, that they build fortified cities called burhs. So if you think of Pittsburgh or Harrisburg, you think this is a fortified city. They create, instead of just having sort of a band of men who go out and protect things, that they need to fortify their cities against the Vikings. Alfred creates a navy in order to stop the incoming vessels of Vikings. So eventually, his new reorganization of the Anglo-Saxons, and he creates with his military reforms, he's able to win a very key battle, which is the Battle of Edington. Very important. He defeats Earl Guthrum, and this, as I mentioned earlier, this was the creation of the Danelaw here, right along the Thames River, that they were able to come to a deal that Alfred would retain Wessex, and the Vikings would get everything north of the Thames River. Along with this, Alfred issues the first of the great Anglo-Saxon law codes, which is called Dumbuck. And here it preserves all the customary laws of the Anglo-Saxon world, and his issues of command. And he begins a great history, that he wanted to preserve the history of his people and all their great accomplishments and how they were able to tame the Vikings. And this is called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And he famously has a daughter, Aethelred. And she is married off to the king of Mercia, and he's able to through his daughter to gain more and more influence. And Aethelfred is famous, the Lady of Mercia, and she led her troops in combat from time to time, and she was just definitely her father's daughter, and she was a magnificent leader in Mercia. And if her brother had been half of what she was, he would have been he'd got the title the Great as well. So Alfred the Great is fondly remembered as one of the greatest kings of England for his great defeat of the Vikings and his reorganization of this society. So as I said, Anglo-Saxon England was in its earliest times was a pagan realm, in that these people brought their traditional Germanic religion over, and you can see here on this map that this is the only region that was a pagan within all of Europe by by 600. So Christians decided, or the Pope famously decides that they must reconvert this area, because that is the goal of Christians, is to make other people Christians, because they want to preserve these people's souls in the afterlife, and therefore it's essential within the Christian mission in order to bring about conversion of all peoples, to tell all peoples the truth as they would conceive of it as. And so Augustine of Canterbury, this monk from Italy, he becomes the first archbishop of Anglo-Saxon England. He was sent on a missionary effort, and they were not initially enormously successful, but finally Augustine is able to send out his monks, and they're able to found these new cathedrals, and they're able to convert the kings. And this is what is key within any society, that you just don't go out and preach on the street corner and try to convert people this way, but rather, if you can convert a king, all the king's followers will usually follow what the king does, and sort of this conversion effort then trickles down. And there is sort of limited success on, okay, we have converted the king of Kent or East Anglia, because remember what I said about paganism. You can bring in as many gods as you want. It's not a big deal to a pagan, whereas a Christian, you can only have one god. So these kings would say, oh yeah, sure, no problem, I'll become a Christian, so they get the statues of the crucifix of Christ crucified, and they would just take it and put it in their temple right along with all their other pagan deities. So it was no big deal. So it's kind of debatable on how successful some of these conversion efforts were, but eventually, of course, enough Christian monks and missionaries and enough kings are converted through marriages to Christian princesses from Gaul, that they are able to sort of Christianize all the land over several generations, and by bringing in sort of this pagan religion through a syncretism, as we talked about in one of our previous lectures, that they're able to bring these two customs together. For instance, the Willibrord, the famous missionary, Anglo-Saxon missionary monk, he goes into a pagan shrine, an area where there's a lot of sacred trees dedicated to the god Woden, and he takes his axe and he cuts down the trees, and he then builds a church with the lumber that he makes from these trees. So in a way, this is like bringing the two together, the sacred grove, and he turns into a sacred Christian shrine built from the very wood of those trees. So this is a way to bring together traditional customs, kind of, and Christian missionary efforts. And these saints were so important. Famously, Saint Cuthbert. He was beloved in the north, in Northumbria, and he would take his evenings, and he would go stand in the sea, and he was enormously he would just treat his body awfully, and he would live as a poor man, and he would go everywhere, and he would preach to these people, and he would live so humbly and so simply, and people saw great power in this, and supposedly, he would perform miracles, and there were legends of his miracles. Now, whether these are true or not is not the province of history to determine, but the legends of this were very important within conversion efforts, that the saints, that these people who lived these Spartan lifestyles were thought of as great, powerful, and holy, and so therefore people wanted to emulate them, who wanted to be a part of this effort. So in this way, Christianity also came to be the dominant religion. And finally, within paganism, remember there is only the warrior elite are the only ones who are going to get to the highest heavens, or this grand celestial paradise in Valhalla. Whereas in Christianity, the door is open to everyone. So from the lowliest slave to the highest king, if you participate within Christianity, heavenly bliss is eventually open to everyone. So this is very attractive for people who are not part of this warrior elite within Anglo-Saxon culture. So for these reasons, largely Christianity was highly successful. And we've talked about a lot of this, but the earliest ways of converting people came out of monasteries, and today you will see the name Minster on things in England, such as Westminster or York Minster Cathedral, and this is an area where monks lived formerly, and that they would then go out from this area and they would convert people. And the monasteries that were built here, which are just houses of the monks, they became enormously important cultural centers. They were the area where economic transactions were done. People were educated. The nobility were educated, taught to read and write in many cases in these monasteries. And they were also the preservation of all records were kept in monasteries. So these are highly important cultural centers, economic centers, and education, sort of universities, if you will. Schools. And eventually, these Anglo-Saxon monasteries will come to control up to a third of the land in all of England. And remember that there was a division between Celtic Christianity and Britannia, Romano-British Christianity. For the 200 years that the Anglo-Saxons came and conquered and Rome had left. So there was a differentiation between sort of how they practiced Christianity and certain dates on things. And you will read within Venerable Bede one of these great disagreements over the dating of Easter and why this was so important. And ultimately it was decided in a great council at the Synod of Whitby that the Romans were correct on account of their authority, because St. Peter, being the highest figure within the Christian pantheon, that the Pope in Rome, as the successor of Peter, the vicar of Christ, ultimately had the authority to decide on what was right and wrong, and that all Anglo-Saxon nations would then, or kingdoms would then follow the way of Roman Christianity because of the authority of Peter. So the authority here is very important within early Christianity. And we see really an interesting thing here at there's a famous archaeological excavation at Sutton Hoo, which is an area of England, and we see that within this burial site, this is like a pagan burial site where with an Anglo-Saxon king. It might have been King Redwald, and we see here many Christian emblems, and it's brought together with this Viking funeral and you see there's a sword, two swords there, one with Salus and Paulus, which meaning from the Apostle Paul and his conversion to Christianity, that he is transformed from Saul to Paul. So is this a Anglo-Saxon king who was converted, who sort of still preserved many of the pagan rites? But it's a perfect example of sort of this syncretism, this bringing together of religious rites and the differing Christianities of the time period. And it's also an enormously important cultural excavation site within Romano-Britain here, but it shows the wealth, and it shows the cultural complexity and religious syncretism that has come together through all of the of Anglo-Saxon history. So it's a very fascinating site, and I encourage you to read some more about it. So finally, I just want to hit on one of the last kings of Anglo-Saxon period, and that was St. Edward the Confessor. And he is a great benefactor to the church, and always remembering in the medieval period, if you get a title like the Blessed, the Confessor, the Religious, it's generally because you were not a very good king. And so therefore you sort of get a title that it talks about your benevolence to the church because you were a lousy war leader. And the Anglo-Saxons sort of had preserved this tradition that they were, or that they had transformed all the way from their earliest times as sort of these pagan war leaders to sort of these benevolent Christian kings. That post-conversion comes with it that there is a hierarchical succession, that we have gone all the way from a war leader where Witan decides who is the next king, to basically the preservation of succession, that they had conquered the Vikings. They had become these famous kings of England. And it all comes tumbling down with King Edward the Confessor. And he did build many things. Famously, you can still see his chapel at Westminster in London. And he was a great benefactor of the church, but he has no male heir in his throne, and there was a great debate over who is going to be the king after Edward the Confessor. And he sort of decides on, famously on his deathbed, he reaches out and grabs the hand of his leading man, the greatest of his earls or ealdormen, Harold Godwinson, who will become the next king, Harold. But then there was some disagreement that Harold Hardrada, king of Norway, would become king, or Duke William of Normandy, who was William the Bastard, meaning not to describe his personality, but rather that he was an illegitimate child of his father. But eventually William the Bastard will become William the Conqueror, the Norman king who comes over and defeats Harold Godwinson, or King Harold, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. But this succession crisis, that after sort of you see this flowering of the Anglo-Saxon kingship under Edward the Confessor, and then you see just a collapse of the entire system, and that eventually this will bring about the process of the Norman invasion through this indecision about kingship. So we see here the culmination of sort of the Anglo-Saxon period under Edward the Confessor. And we have seen a transformation of this society all the way from raiding war bands to that of hierarchical Christian kingship. And the Anglo-Saxons have preserved many cultural things for us, including language, trial by jury, and many of the great traditions of the time period, and legendary figures that come down to us still to our own day, such as King Alfred the Great, and as well as King Arthur, the legends of King Arthur. So I hope that you have come to have an appreciation for the Anglo-Saxons and their contributions to medieval society, and as well as to modern society. So thanks for watching. Until next time, stay healthy.